We tend to look at the Middle Ages as a backward, dirty, unpredictable era. But if you look closely, you'll notice something completely different. The people who lived through constant war, disease, and brutal weather actually built a survival system so durable that it could outlast situations most modern people wouldn't endure for a single week. What set them apart wasn't strength or equipment. It was their ability to read the natural world, take materials that look primitive to us, and turn them into life-saving solutions refined over generations. With no electricity, no machinery, and not even a concept of technology, they still managed to store food, keep the fire alive through winter, filter drinkable water from cloudy streams, and treat wounds using nothing more than what grew around their homes. Those skills didn't come from books. They came from the fact that every mistake cost them an entire season of hunger, or sometimes a life. The more we study their world, the clearer it becomes that their preparation wasn't inferior to any form of modern prepping. In many cases, it was more practical and more reliable, because none of it depended on a system that could collapse. And if you're curious about the secrets our ancestors used to survive when everything around them was falling apart, keep watching, because what comes next might make you see the safety of our modern world in a completely different light. If you find this perspective interesting, feel free to drop a comment so we can dive even deeper into the conversation. In an age with no lighters, no matches, and none of the modern tools we take for granted, creating a fire wasn't just a technical skill. It was the moment that decided whether you lived or died. Medieval people understood that better than anyone, because a single unexpected cold night or a long stretch of rain could put an entire family in danger. That's why they trained themselves to master flint and steel fire making, a method that seems simple from the outside, but actually demands patience, experience, and a very sharp sense of touch. When the steel strikes the flint, tiny sparks, almost invisible, fly off, and only if they land on the right kind of tinder, char cloth burned without oxygen, dried hoof fungus, teased flax, moss, or carefully prepared bark fibers, will the spark catch and grow into a glowing ember. That moment is always tense. Blow too hard and it dies. Blow too softly and the heat won't build. And when that final ember finally blooms into the first small flame, it's more than just a convenience for cooking. It's the promise of a safer night, a warmer body, and a home that can hold on to its heat a little longer. What makes this even more remarkable is that the technique is still valuable today. Many people still practice flint and steel because they understand that fire never betrays those who know how to bring it to life. If you've ever tried striking a flame yourself, you know exactly what that feels like. For us today, fire is just a button press, a twist of a switch, an everyday convenience we assume will always be there. But for medieval families, fire was the thin line between life and death, and everyone understood that if it went out on a windy night, everything could collapse faster than they imagined. It sounds dramatic, but in wooden houses with thatched roofs, where cold air slipped through every crack and the dirt floor soaked up the evening moisture, the temperature could drop low enough that a child or an elderly person might not wake up the next morning. That's why keeping the fire alive became the most important task in every medieval home, more important than food or clean water, because as long as the fire burned, they had warmth to survive the night, light to work by, and smoke to preserve their meat. In many communities, the ability to maintain a fire was almost seen as sacred. The most skilled firekeepers were sometimes invited to other homes to rescue a dying hearth by carrying over a jar of still glowing embers. And here's the twist that surprises most modern people. They feared losing the fire more than losing the house. A house could be rebuilt, but a fire snuffed out during a snowstorm meant the entire family would face a merciless cold, with no way to bring back heat unless the neighbors stepped in. That wasn't romanticized history. It was a reality where every mistake carried an immediate price.
They're beautiful.
Only when you look at how they guarded each ember do you realize how casually we treat something that was once considered the greatest power in human life. And if you've ever lived through a winter blackout, share your experience in the comments. You'll instantly understand why fire was once synonymous with survival. In medieval villages tucked deep in the woods or along the mountains, places where firewood wasn't always guaranteed and winter could drag on long enough to drain every storage jar day by day, people had to find a way to cook without relying on a constantly burning flame. That's why the earth oven, a cooking pit beneath the ground, became one of the simplest yet most effective survival inventions humans ever created. They started by digging a deep pit, lining it with stones, and burning a fire inside for hours until the stones were so hot that even brushing against them could burn your skin. When the flames died down, the food was wrapped in leaves, bark, or coarse cloth, sometimes even coated in a layer of clay to keep it moist and protect it from ash. Everything was then placed at the bottom of the pit, covered with soil, and left there for hours, sometimes overnight. The fascinating thing is that this method used very little fuel, yet retained heat incredibly well. Tough meat became tender, roots cooked evenly, and grains became easier to digest. But what made this technique truly invaluable in times of chaos wasn't the flavor. It was the secrecy. A meal could be cooked entirely underground with no smoke, no visible flame, and nothing to reveal your location to enemies or wandering thieves. For many medieval families, the earth oven wasn't just a cooking tool, it was a shield between safety and being discovered. And even though the world has changed, the method still survives in bushcraft and off-grid communities today, reminding us that sometimes survival begins with a hole dug the right way. Before refrigerators or any kind of mechanical preservation existed, medieval people had to face a brutal truth. A single batch of spoiled food could leave an entire family hungry for weeks. That fear forced them to rely on something that seemed primitive, but was actually the most stable resource they had: the temperature of the earth itself. Cold pits, root cellars, and burial holes lined with dry leaves, straw, or clay became the places where they essentially bet their whole winter. Underground, the temperature stayed lower and far more stable than above, enough to keep vegetables, butter, milk, and even fresh meat good for days or weeks. They also created astonishing natural systems. Clay jars buried up to the neck to avoid sunlight, butter wrapped in cloth to cool quickly, baskets of food placed in running water to stop bacteria from growing, or grains hung near chimneys to dry slowly with a gentle heat. What's surprising is that none of these methods depended on complex tools. They only required careful observation of heat, wind, moisture, and timing. That understanding is what allowed them to survive scorching summers and brutal winters without a single watt of electricity. And here's the twist. In a long-term blackout, These ancient techniques often prove more reliable than most modern devices. When everything stops, the earth never betrays them. In medieval villages where winter dragged on like a never-ending curse, food preservation wasn't just a routine. It was an unwritten law of survival. People used to say that if a single potato began to rot, the entire storage room could be overtaken by mold within days. And once that happened, no miracle could save a family from the hunger waiting at the end of the freezing season. That's why natural cooling methods were treated like secret arts passed down through generations. Not because they were mystical, but because they protected lives like a talisman everyone had to learn how to use. They dug root cellars deep underground, where the air stayed cool and stable, then lined them with straw, dry leaves, or even clay to create the perfect humidity. Enough to slow decay without letting food turn soggy. They buried clay jars up to the rim so food stayed away from sunlight, placed baskets of provisions in running water so the natural cold could sweep away bacteria, and hung seeds and herbs near the chimney where gentle warmth dried them and thin smoke kept insects away. What's strange is that these techniques were never seen as inventions, but as rituals woven into the rhythm of life, done on the right day, at the right hour, in the right season. Because even a tiny mistake could turn winter into a death sentence. And it's this half-scientific, half-mythic quality that kept the methods alive today in off-grid communities, where people understand that nature follows its own rules, and only those who respect them get the chance to keep going. If you've ever watched food spoil because of one small oversight, share it in the comments. Lessons like that are worth more than any recipe. In a world with no antibiotics, no refrigerators, and no safety net to protect people from hunger, the scariest thing wasn't running out of food. It was watching an entire harvest turn toxic with mold in just a few days. Medieval people understood this better than anyone, and that fear drove them to develop a method that sounds simple, but was absolutely vital: air drying with wind and smoke. After each harvest, they never left food sitting in baskets or on the floor, where damp, cold air could quietly feed invisible spores. Instead, they hung everything high, just under the roof, where waves of smoke from the hearth drifted upward and coated the food in a thin, almost invisible film. They called it the cloak of smoke, a layer that slowly dried the crops, repelled insects, and most importantly, suppressed the growth of things no one could see. Strangely enough, no one really knew where the technique came from. It felt like a tradition that was half myth, half necessity, followed as if an unspoken law governed it. And that fragile veil of smoke, something modern people see as nothing more than a byproduct of cooking, acted as a gatekeeper between survival and starvation. One day of drying done wrong, a string hung a few inches too low, or a moment of moisture left unchecked, and everything could be ruined. That's why air drying was never just hanging things up to dry. It was a primal survival ritual, silent but powerful. And if you've ever tried smoke drying food yourself, you understand exactly why this method has lasted for 1,000 years. In the Middle Ages, clean water wasn't something you could get by turning a tap. It was a dangerous challenge where every mouthful could carry disease. Streams that looked calm and harmless were often filled with decaying animal remains, layers of mud, and countless microorganisms invisible to the human eye. And yet people survived, century after century, thanks to a technique that was both primitive and brilliant: filtering water with cloth, sand, and charcoal. They began by letting the water run through thick linen to trap debris, insects, and floating particles. Then that cloudy water flowed into a clay jar or wooden trough arranged in layers: large stones to stop heavier impurities, fine sand to clarify the liquid, and finally, a layer of black charcoal that absorbed smells, toxins, and things they couldn't even name. What's strange is that they never viewed this as science. It was an art of living, where each layer had to be washed, dried, and placed in the right order like a ritual. The final water that dripped out wasn't pure by modern standards, but it was safe enough to carry them through long seasons of plague and sickness. And even today, during blackouts or natural disasters, this ancient method is still remembered as a reliable lifeline. In the Middle Ages, light wasn't something you could buy, switch on, or charge. It was so precious that families had to calculate how many hours of candlelight they could afford each night. And in that harsh reality, they created something both crude and powerful: tallow. Animal fat melted down, purified, and transformed into light, warmth, and sometimes pure survival. It sounds simple, but to make a single jar of tallow, a family had to save every scrap of fat from an animal after slaughtering it, cook it slowly for hours to remove impurities, then pour it into molds or soak it into bundles of dried rushes to make rushlights. These weren't just lamps. They were the poor man's way of pushing back the darkness without buying the expensive beeswax candles reserved for the wealthy. And here's the real political flex of that era. The rich burned clean, fragrant beeswax with bright flames and minimal smoke. Meanwhile, peasants lit heavy-smelling, smoky, cheap tallow. And it was that humble light that helped most medieval families survive pitch-black winters. For them, each rushlight didn't just illuminate a path or help mend clothes at night. It warmed hands, melted thin ice, reheated a cold bowl of porridge, or kept an infant from freezing. And the twist? During long sieges or failed harvests, tallow was even eaten as a last resort energy source. Not delicious, but enough to keep someone alive. Today, when a few hours without electricity can send people into panic, looking back at this ancient light makes it clear why medieval folk treated animal fat as a kind of strategic fuel. In medieval countryside, where doctors were a distant concept and medicine existed only in stories passed from mouth to ear, people had no choice but to rely on whatever grew at their feet: plants. But don't be mistaken, herbal medicine back then wasn't the romantic scene of bunches of herbs hanging by the door. It was a life and death gamble, where choosing the wrong leaf or shaving the wrong root could turn a cure into poison long before anyone realized something was wrong. Medieval people believed that plants like yarrow could stop bleeding right on the battlefield. Garlic could push back infection. Thyme and sage could ease a struggling breath inside smoke-filled homes. And plantain or comfrey could draw poison from a bite or help skin knit back together. These plants were harvested at specific hours, dried in shade, ground on stone, and brewed in boiling water like a ritual that was half primitive science, half taboo. But the most shocking part is this: most medieval children didn't survive because of medicine. They survived because of leaves. They grew up in homes filled with the smell of crushed garlic, sage warmed over heat, and the earthy scent of dried roots, a healing fragrance modern people can hardly imagine. And this fragility made medieval families painfully cautious. Every dose was a gamble, every recovery a small miracle. Looking back, you realize they relied on nature in a way we've almost forgotten. If you've ever tried using herbs as medicine, share your experience in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next hidden survival stories.